G2 Esports is a team that was labeled the French super team. And when you look at the lineup of players they have, that reputation, that nickname is absolutely deserved, because 4 of the 5 players in this lineup have won majors in some of the best French teams of all time, but they did it in different cores. So, okay, yes, Shox and MBK played together in the LDLC lineup that won DreamHack Winter 2014, won a major. But then it was NBK, Kenny S and Apex who played in a different era of the same concept team a year later and won DreamHack Cluj-Napoca in the latter part of 2015. So these are 2 very different kind of core sets of players merged into one team, because last year the French scene found itself at its very lowest. Its teams were going out in last place of majors. They weren't winning the big tournaments anymore. Yes, you had the G2 lineup of Shox that was very skilled, and absolutely, in terms of firepower, him and Scream could take on anyone and they could make exciting matches, but they weren't going to win a major. Then you had the Envious lineup, and they still had the core of some really good pieces in terms of entry fraggers, AWPers, but they didn't have the tactical system in place. They didn't have the team approach, and so the best they could do was be average. They couldn't win the massive tournaments. And so what they did was they took the best pieces from this. And they didn't say who's playing best right now, which player's on form. They just took the best pieces historically, and they put together a lineup of these 4 players that was going to make the super team. If you wanted to have an entry fragger in the history of CSGO from France, you'd pick Apex. This is the guy in all his teams who'll be the pure entry fragger, will be the guy who goes in and is willing to run into a brick wall if you tell him to. He's that kind of dedicated entry fragger who doesn't have to think for himself. You tell him where to go and what to do, and he runs in and creates the situation for you. Then, if you want to pick an AWPer from any country, you're going to pick Kenny S. This guy, one of the most dominant AWPers we've ever had, one of the best star player AWPers, can hit any shot, very aggressive with how he does it, always makes the opponent have to think about what he's doing. You look at NBK. This is someone who was a star player early in CSGO, who was someone who was a fantastic clutch player, fantastic big game player in very games. But in the latter days of LDLC, of Envious, and now G2, he's become a supportive player. He's someone who's there to set up the other players in his team, use his veteran experience and his high skill level to be a versatile player, to plug in any gap that needs to be filled. And then in Shox, you had someone who even last year was one of the best players in the world, a superstar impact player, but he's not playing that role now. Now he's the in-game leader. Now he's the brain behind the game. And so you're not going to see him dominate the game with kills as much, but you're going to see him have a big impact on the game. He's the guy who's making sure that free-flowing style that they have is going at the right rhythm. The pacing's correct. His players are getting out there with the right kind of approach to make the team style work. And crucially, within that concept, he's going to win clutch rounds. He's going to be that player that still can come up with magic in the key moment. So at the moment, G2 is a team that are defined by the phrase free-flowing. They're a team where they have a tactical approach, but it's not a playbook that's 10 pages deep with 15 strats per map. They're a team that's got a very basic style of how to play. And from within that style, which is very much based on having strong players in each of the roles that they have in the game, when that's working, when they're in that flow, and when players are playing at a good level, they in theory can beat every team. They can win this major thanks to that style and thanks to that level of play. It's not as calculated as the other teams. Now, the tough part for G2 is, yes, when they're in that flow, that makes them very difficult to play against. That makes them a team that not a lot of people have answers for, because they're playing a very fundamental, simple style, but off the skill level of their team. The downside for G2 is they can't always play at that level. And if they aren't at that level, they don't have something to fall back on in the way that an Astralis or a FaZe do. They don't have a style that they can play out of and make a different player play a role. Everyone kind of has their set role, and it's up to each person to do his job. So the thing with G2 is they have one of the highest ceilings in the game, but of all the elite teams, they're maybe the only one that you'd bet on maybe not to make the semifinals if things don't go well, if they get the wrong matchup in the quarterfinals, if this player isn't playing up to par in a particular set of matches. So they're a team that even they themselves know that the potential is incredible, but the day-to-day results, very inconsistent, very variable as they stand right now. So the star player of G2 is Kenny S. And this is a player who, it's not even enough to say he was the best AWPer of all time in CSGO. He's one of the best players of all time in CSGO. And once you get up to talking about those 4 or 5 best players to ever play the game, the fact that he's an AWPer shows you how dominant he is, because he needs one of the most expensive weapons in the game. He needs a gun which doesn't give him much kill reward, which in many situations, you're going to have to save the weapon and not go for the play that you would if you were in a rifle situation, you were in that 2-on-4 or that 3-on-5. He's the player where, in theory, you should be more limited in terms of the impact you can have as a superstar player. But he's someone who puts up some of the highest numbers we've ever seen in the game, who's able to dominate entire maps, entire halves of games, and the entire enemy's game plan is, where is Kenny S? What is Kenny S doing? And can you shut him down? Can you limit him? And so that longevity of his career, the fact that he's managed to get back this confidence level, to go for the most difficult shots in the game, make him the toughest AWPer to deal with right now. And that is a massive, massive kind of feather in the cap of G2 when they're trying to win a major. I think the role of Shox in G2 at the moment is very unique for his career, because he is someone where, with the different lineups he played with, he did sometimes have to switch up his role, like he was the superstar mid-round player in very games. But you go to LDLC, and suddenly he's becoming more of an entry fragger, and he's having to take up more of an aggressive role, and he's not the guy winning the clutches at the end of the game, which is one of the things he is more than most famous for, and has some of the best statistical numbers for winning clutches. But now in this team, he's not the big fragger, he's not the star player. In fact, you look to many other players in the team to be the one who are going to have the biggest impact. But where he is still able to be one of the best players in the world is he is incredible in clutch round situations. Here's someone who, he isn't like a Zipnix type character who's calculating what to do and what the correct play is. He very much plays off his intuition, but somehow his intuition allows him to have a sense of where the pressure points are in a clutch situation, where he can put himself to make the situation a little bit easier for him, but put the pressure on the opponent to make a play, where he can then make a scenario where people are hiding against him. He can flush them out and make them try and duel him in a situation. And that internal clock he has going for how much time he's got to develop a play and to make the initial move, which can then lead to a scenario which, if successful, you can still win the round from, it's almost unparalleled. There's very few players always seem to have that timing down and the pacing of how quickly or how slowly to take a round and have a good chance to win it, like Shox does. So within the lineup, when you talk about this team as the French super team, that applies to 4 of the 5 players. You look at those 4 players and you'd say, right, if I wanted one of the all-time great French teams at almost any era, these might be the players I'd pick. But one player you wouldn't pick, because he's a new player, is Body. And he is a player who only got to the top level last year. And the context of how he got to the top level shows you why, while yes, he wouldn't be part of that super team narrative, he has become a key element in this team and one of the most unexpectedly successful players within their system, actually, which is when he got to the team in 2016, they were a team that was in shambles. They had Shox, one of the best players of all time. They had Scream, a very good player, but a player who always had difficulties figuring out his style of play. They had RPK, who was a veteran, but had a very set, consistent, but not high level style of play. And then they had Smiths, who was a veteran, who was kind of on the downslope of his career, whose style wasn't as effective, couldn't be quite as good as an AWPer, and therefore was struggling within the team. So they brought Body in as the last member, they brought him in as the 5th player, and everyone else in that team had a set, defined role and had strengths that they were going to play to. And the logic really was, right, we're the veterans, we're going to do what we do, we're going to get ours, and your job is to take up whatever's left. You play an off role. You do this spot here because no one else wants to do that spot. You play this situation over here because no one else can play that area in the site. And it doesn't matter if you get a lot of kills, it doesn't matter if it goes well for you. Try not to die, try to just contribute, and these players over here are going to play their roles, hopefully to a good level and win the game. And what we discovered about Body is, whereas this would break most young players don't have the mental fortitude for that, wouldn't be able to adapt, even within the context of having very little expected from him, he was able to consistently improve as a player and play at a good level. Now, he wasn't as good as he is this year, and that's the key element in this G2 lineup. Now in G2, when they've seen what he was capable of last year, and they've got a different lineup of players, and you've got players like Shox sacrificing certain elements of their game, and NBK there to set other people up, now Body's emerged as legitimately, the 2nd or 3rd best player in this team, and now he's a player who can get a lot of kills, who can make plays for himself, who sometimes gets a position that's very favorable for him. And now what we're actually starting to see was, we thought the French scene was tapped out for talent, but this is actually the guy who was lurking the whole time, who was the next star player from France. And now he's in a team where, while he's playing with Hall of Fame players, legendary players, major winners, he's actually having a high impact himself. He's having positions sculpted out for him, crafted and kind of given to him on a silver platter, and he's making the most of all these situations, and I think impressing teams tournament on a tournament basis. So whereas the others, you kind of know where they're going to come from, what their level of players, what their style is. This is the guy it's exciting about this team, because the potential's still there to keep improving and to have a high impact. And he's a player who, because of G2's problems at the majors last year, never had to have a big impact on a major. So if he can have a high level performance at a major, that can be the X factor that takes a G2 and propels them into those late stages of the tournament where then it's possible to win the major.